contestation over the new Christian right, the moral majority, and the way in which the moral majority itself then counter-accuses the others of secular humanism, and the whole culture wars between the so-called Christian right and secular humanists. But of course, one has to understand that there has been a long history of debates around these issues in the United States, that there is a reappearance, what could be called the two clauses. There has been always a constitutional debate about whether the primacy of the no establishment clause or the primacy of the free exercise clause. And there have been pendular movements in American history more in support of one or the other. So there are all kinds of debates, long constitutional debates in American history. Then of course you could say that there is a process of disestablishment. I have put in terms of three different processes of disestablishment. The first disestablishment of the Protestant churches, which led to, of course, the separation and then the model of denominationalism. But it was countered by a very strong Christian reaction of evangelical Protestantism, a hegemonic to Christianize the nation. So the whole discourse of a Christian nation and the way in which this led to the anti-Catholic nativism and so on and so on. Then, of course, you have a destabilization again at the turn of, from the 19th to the 20th century with the emergence, the first emergence of Protestant fundamentalism as a reaction to what could be called the disestablishment of Protestantism from the American universities, the secularization of the American university, which is in reaction to the introduction of the social sciences, introduction to critical methods of hermeneutics and biblical studies. So the notion of the fundamentals of the faith is a reaction to critical theologies, liberal theologies, and the split between liberal and conservative fundamentalist Protestantism, but also in reaction to the immigrant non-Protestant majorities which has taken over our cities. So the notion of this being a city on a hill, and suddenly you see that the major metropolitan cities are really places of corruption, and that they are really, really of Ram and Romanism, if you wish, and that therefore you have, for the first time, an insecure notion where Protestants don't feel anymore that this is really the second, that this is, we are building the kingdom of God here on earth. So you have a retreat of a certain form of Protestantism that becomes then premillennial, that thinks that this country is beyond redemption, and only the second coming of Christ can redeem, but only the few of us who have remained really loyal. And so, but this Protestant fundamentalism that then retreats from a new public sphere comes back, of course, in the 70s, 80s, as a reaction to a third disestablishment, the disestablishment of the Protestant ethic, a notion of a unitary form of morality. So if you have first, the first disestablishment introduces religious pluralism, the second introduces a kind of ideological, cultural, ethnic pluralism, but still a moral uniformity. So it is the kind of the counterculture, the revolution leading with the sexual revolution, the revolution in morals, so that we have multiculturalism. But now multiculturalism as different forms of morality, different forms of ethical life in the United States. And it is this reaction against this kind of ethical moral pluralism that is very much characteristic, I think, of the new Protestant fundamentalist reaction. So you have a constant reopening of these issues, but now for the first time you also have, in the United States, the conflicts were never over religion per se, because in every cultural war you have religion on both sides of the barricades. What characterizes probably the latest debates, for the first time you have a kind of a religious attack on secularism and a kind of a secular critique of religion itself. So what was more a typical European cleavage between religious secular cleavages emerges at least in the more minority expression of the culture war in America in the last 20 years. It has to do with the definition of the civil religion, American civil religion, and how much it can be completely secularized, or how much it really has to have an almost Christian form, the definition of an American civil religion.
Well, I think, yeah, in France, you can express the the drama of the last decades, and will continue, this drama will continue, I promise, in the next decades, as the drama of moving from this original idea of the situation of secular, laic regime being the establishment of certain principles against this powerful aggression from a single source of authority, the Catholic source, to a situation which is rather like the rest of us in the world, where the really big challenge comes from diversity, religious diversity, a much greater religious diversity than ever before. Right, so to speak in Rajiv's terms, in a certain sense, I think that these help. You know, the intra-religious versus the between-religious, inter-religious domination by one religion by another, or intra-religious. Of course, in the context of the original fight against the Catholic Church, the inter-religious, because they were thinking of persecuting Protestants, but the intra-religious was the really big thing, control of the church over its members or over the whole of society. And if you're really focused on this, you can forget the inter-religious, and that is what has actually been happening. In other words, people didn't think, what's the message we're sending to these Muslim kids when we outlaw the scarf, in terms of what's their place and how they are accepted or not accepted in contemporary France. The typical, if you like, to speak Canadian language, multicultural issue. It's not not the framework in which it appeared for them. Now, the drama is that this isn't a purely, of course, religious issue either. This is another very important point I think we should bring out, that very often these issues of the right kind of regime for religion get all mixed up with a lot of other issues. And one of the big problems of contemporary France is really a problem that can be described in terms of the reception of immigrants of very different cultures and how the integration has worked or has not worked. The French are the victims of their incredible success in the earlier part of the 20th century in integrating other Europeans who were also from Catholic culture, so they weren't that different, but Poles, but Italians, but Portuguese, Spanish, and so on. I mean, to the extent that, I like to say this because people, Yves Montand, maybe I show my age, anybody remember the actor Yves Montand? Right?
La guerre est finie.
Right, he's Italian, right? You wouldn't, I mean, this is absurd sounding, but this is somebody so totally assimilated into France that, you know, he's a French icon and so on, and you can go on and on. I mean, it's even more remarkable than America, because people retain some memory that this person is this origin or that origin in America. But in France, the tremendous success of this assimilation procedure was integration by total assimilation, was that these people ended up being, you know, as French as everybody else. Now, this stopped working with the Maghrébins in the post-Second World War period, for a lot of reasons, partly because the prosperity period ended and all these people couldn't be integrated by the trade unions, and partly because the differences were so great and much greater than in the earlier, and partly because these people also had this extra problem, extra barrier. These people had a memory of their colonial relation to France. So there's a sense of alienation that a lot of Maghrébins have that come from that. But you get the crisis in France, in a certain sense, the tremendous difficulty of really integrating these people. They can't be integrated by the same total assimilation to the language and the whole style of life and everything that happened with the Poles and the Italians and so on. But if not, then how can they be integrated? And then you get the kind of nativist reaction coming out, where if they can't integrate, don't want to integrate, maybe we don't want them here, and you got Le Pen and so on, and you get this terrible relationship growing up, which involves a great deal of discrimination. I mean, it's very clear, and they made these tests to show it, that if you send in your CV for a job and they look at your postal code and you come from, you know, whatever it is, one of these banlieues, they put that one in the wastebasket basket and they look at the other ones. Or it happens again and again that you send in CVs and instead of the Ali Muhammad, you put Jean La Fortune, and the person comes for the interview. What are you? And so there is this there is this tremendous problem, and it's difficult to advise really how to deal with it. It's so immense, of alienation, therefore rebellion, therefore the taking on of very often rebellious identities in relation to France, which can include a Muslim dimension, or Arab-speaking, or a verlan. This extraordinary, as it were, language has been created in the banlieue, and the tremendous interference between the issue of what place to give to religious minorities and how to integrate these culturally different minorities, the inability to separate these, and the refusal to look at that other problem in the face, that refacing their own discriminatory practices, has meant that they've tended to deal with it in this form of, here's an alien religion with various practices that we find very troubling, so let us put a barrier up. And it has made the problem of integration worse. I think this is not the only European country in which this kind of dynamic is going on, but it's very dangerous, very potentially very, very tragic. In other words, the entire regime of French laïcité has to refocus itself on the issue of diversity. Now, let me say at the end, there are some signs that's happening. HALDE, c'est quoi? Haute autorité. This is the authority that you can appeal to if you think you've been discriminated against.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. What is the word? What's the French name for it? Haute autorité de LD. Anyway, it's been set up by legislation in the last 6 years or so, and it's already beginning to operate. And there are various measures which show that the penny is dropping among many French people, that the problem is now not intra, but inter-community, inter-religious, inter-ethnic domination. One has to deal with that. But it's fighting against this very powerful républicain mindset. So,
I can make a kind of transition from the way you described republicanism, which became a source of French nationalism, I would say, which led even to the refusal of the European Constitution in a referendum. And so therefore there are also conflicts with the Europeanness of France today when they become more defensive in their republican ideology and definition of Europeanness. There I want to go saying that it's not only in France, as you said, but also in Netherlands. Netherlands also, which is a country much more related with multiculturalism, framing the question of difference not in terms of republicanism, but multiculturalism, also falls short today of framing the question of difference in terms of multiculturalism, because I think, so we are in a new phase, I would say, because after a period of, for instance, celebration of multiculturalism today in Europe, nobody speaks about multiculturalism, maybe except Tariq Madoud in Great Britain. Britain is an exceptional case. And
very much on the defensive.
Huh?
Very much on the defensive, though.
Yeah, very much under defensive, and that's interesting because
it's a
multiculturalism,
four-letter
which was never very much famous and popular in France, but very much acknowledged in the Netherlands.
Yeah.
It is considered to not to function anymore because, as they will put it, it means cultural avoidance, which is no longer possible. That is, multiculturalism as something understood, something totally separate communities that are not communicating with each other. The question of normative values of secularism, if they can create some commonness. So the problem of multiculturalism was said to be by many leading intellectuals like Paul Scheffer in the Netherlands, where is the common among people. So multiculturalism failed because it cannot integrate Muslims, migrants especially, to the Dutch system. So I think this is important, just to note that multiculturalism is no longer framing our debates of the new controversies, and it doesn't provide any frame to integrate differences, to represent differences. Whereas a kind of civilizational discourse appeared in understanding these differences. And I think it's, again, very interesting because it echoes with the past. I said at the very beginning of my talk in the Turkish case, this distinction between civilization and culture was made, which is also a kind of debate, of course, that took place in France and in Germany, when you read famous book of Norbert Elias, you find this same debates saying how we define, therefore, what is particular to us. Is it the civilization is something universal or something specific? And now more and more, these debates of difference are framed in terms of civilizational difference. And I think there is a kind of shift in France which defines civilization in more terms of universalistic attire. Today, they shift back to a much more particularistic, culturally and religiously defined civilization. I think that is, for me, is interesting to follow that during these debates. So I would like to pick the Archbishop of Canterbury's, for instance, way of referring to Islam today is very much, maybe, it's open to discussion, in difference and in opposition to that of Pope Benedict XVI's talk in relation to Islam. Because what is interesting is these two different religious personalities who make a move towards Islam, which is quite unexpected for religious persons, and they integrate Islam into their discourse, and that creates a scandal. So if you want to be audible in the European public sphere, you make reference to Islam. That's it. So Islam makes you audible. And so the Pope's speech became very audible because it was, there was nothing else, but calling Europeans, therefore, to link their Christian heritage with European identity. Right, saying that Christianity is rational, has its roots with rationality, in contradistinction with Islam, and calling intellectuals to be sensitive to that and not to leave Christianity beyond the definitions of European identity. Whereas Archbishop of Canterbury, if I understood well, is on the contrary, he's referring to what is already there as Sharia law. It is not in contradistinction, but he's making some kind of cross-cultural link. So he reconstructs Islam in present-day British society. In a way, he de-dramatizes it, not the other way around. So he's not putting some frontiers between civilizations, but a kind of a cross-reading. I'm putting it on the intercultural, intermingling way of putting these. In that respect, I think it's a very interesting move, right? Very interesting move. So in that I would like to, therefore, put in our discussions how the word civilization comes, because people would say, for instance, in relation to Turkish membership in Europe, which was very much refused by the society at large and the politicians as well, because it belonged to a different civilization. And especially French would say, we don't want to say it's different religion, it is civilization, different culture, all right? Because nobody is excluded because they are Muslims, but civilization. So what does it mean, different culture? So this is cultural, religious, ethnic, what is that? And I would like to come to the, during the discussion, our colleague, more literature studies, French, he asked me, what is the acute epistemic, what was it? Distress, okay? Some kind of, something which is lacks in your talks, each of you, is some kind of existential drama, and because he's a literature person, and and I think he's right, and it made me work.
Can I just give the quote that I gave you? From Jean Villard, who's not, of course, a world-famous philosopher, but in the French cultural scene, they don't only consider professional philosophers to indulge in philosophy. Jean Villard, who created the Festival d'Avignon and the Théâtre National Populaire, wrote in a book called De la Tradition Théâtrale in the 1950s, I believe. He said, we know now, I'm translating, we know now that humanism died in 1940, and the world appeared to us as the mosaic of a mad god. And something of this has percolated down into many aspects of French literature and drama and cultural life and so on. And there is what I personally call an acute epistemic distress, which would not quite know what to do with this jeu de paradigme, with this kind of very, very interesting and enlightening, but rather mountaintop playing with very large paradigms of civilization. Because so many people no longer know what paradigm to use. You know, the French have this wonderful expression, ne pas savoir à quel saint se vouer. No longer know what saint to pray, pray to, right? There's a lot of désarroi, there's a lot
Okay.
of distress,
Yeah,
disarray.
I wanted to move, to take this thread because in the Turkish case, which can shed some light, this divide between secularists versus Muslims, let's put it in that way, which is not a divide only between Europe and Islam, but Turkish example is interesting because we can follow and understand, depict these tensions within a Muslim majority country. I think there is a sense of loss, and I think that's an important thing to understand, a feeling of loss, both for the Europeans, because they feel in Europe, I mean the French Republicans, but also the Turkish Republicans, in the sense that secularism, which was used to be maybe under their hegemony, a kind of power, natural power, they are losing the grip. And to give more accurate empirical example, I have spoken about secularism from state politics to street politics, right? That is and it is in the real sense that secularist people, the women's organizations, again, very important, and others, has started demonstrations in Turkey to defend secularism against Islamic majority, again, the question of majority. And this is very interesting because never normally secular citizens would go to the streets because normally they own the public sphere and they don't have to go to the streets to make any politics of opposition. So that was a very important moment for all those who were really describing Turkish secularism as something foreign, imposed from above, and a kind of caricatural, non-ideal type of the French. One should see exactly the particularities and the fact that it's not only a kind of foreign regime, but also makes part of the worldview and habitus and the way people define themselves to the extent they go to the streets to defend it. Right? So there's a kind of anxiety there, of course, and the kind of consciousness, awareness that they are no longer the only hegemonic, let's say, citizens. So I think this would lead me to my last point, which is, in a way, these debates are also related with some kind of competition. Right? The anxiety comes from also the fact that you have to share political power. Now, the government is majority coming from a Muslim background, it's political power, but also you can see it in Iran. Islam comes to power. Islam will be, I think, more and more people, the migrants will be represented in politics, in European politics as well. So politics is one channel of integration, if you want, or entering into the public life. Second is also the cultural capital. We have intellectuals, Islamic intellectuals, and women, even the headscarf women, can be considered as having the cultural capital in the sense of Bourdieu, that is really becoming part of the elite in a way, future elite as professional, educated, and having two cultural capitals, both secular and religious. It gives you more power today, everywhere. So even I think Archbishop is trying to do that. He is having both capitals, both religious and Islamic in a way. And I think these are the new middle classes and elites that are not only excluded, that's how the Turkish experience is interesting for us, because the power is changing hands, and not only in terms of education, political power, but aesthetics and ethics, coming back to the values, normative values. Normative is not only ethics, but also aesthetics. And the headscarf becomes a sign of distinction and not only a sign of stigmatization of Muslims or exclusion. It creates its own aesthetic values with ethical values behind it. And I think in that sense, it goes much deeper than the questions of integration, but it questions whether modernity can only be equated with secular modernity, or are there ways of reappropriating or even inventing modernity from a different civilizational background. Let me put it that way, not the religion.
Well, one important point to clarify here is that for me, I mean, I could talk a lot about Europe, and I want to, but I'll restrict myself to India. What I've been talking about is a certain conception of secularism that developed in the subcontinent between the late 19th century and, say, the 1950s, and I believe was a work of all the religious communities as well as people who define themselves even independent of religious communities. So in a sense, it's late secularism. Late not in the sense that it's died, but late in the sense that it arrived much later, and in a certain sense borrowed from conceptions of secularism that were already available, and in borrowing it, adapted and completely transformed it. Not well, completely, but quite to a substantive extent, transformed it. Okay, but this secularism is in deep crisis in India. And I'd sort of like to give some reasons for why it is in crisis. First of all, because it was late secularism, it was a very rich and complex idea, which was dealing, as I said, both with inter-religious and intra-religious domination, as well as trying to carve out a space which really belonged to everybody. Now, what has happened over the years is that it's come to be identified only as dealing with inter-religious domination, and in particular as something which is there for the protection of the minorities, and even more specifically protection of Muslims. So it's going to be identified as something which protects Muslims. So it's very easy for a number of people to critique it, and by saying that, look, what about that common space, or what about the majority? I mean, this is only for the protection of Muslims, right? And this is a criticism that not many people can easily stave off unless they understand this model of secularism. And I find that a number of my secularist friends actually do not understand what Indian secularism is all about. And that, to my mind, is one of the crises, that the defenders themselves are too lazy to think through what exactly Indian secularism is, and they rely all the time on certain other conceptions of secularism which do not fit the Indian reality. Number two, there has been, since the 1980s, there has been the resurgence of a very vicious kind of ultra-Hindu nationalism, which targets these minorities. So it's a very vicious circle. On the one hand, secularists have to jump to the protection of these religious minorities, namely Muslims, and then they are accused that they are, that they are only looking after the interests of these minorities, and in fact the growth of this ultra religious nationalism, Hindu nationalism, has stifled all internal debate within Muslims, so that it's so easy for people to say that, look, these guys are too orthodox, or they are not bothered about internal reforms within the communities, and so on. And the social psychological mechanism why this happens is very clear. Let's say there are three kinds of threats. I mean, actually there are two threats, but there's one threat which is a perceived threat. There's an external threat. So let's say Hindu majoritarians threaten Muslims, and that is perceived by Muslims as a threat coming from outside. Then there is an internal threat. So Muslims themselves have some Muslims have distanced themselves from their community, and a lot of Muslims might feel that this is a kind of internal threat because this would lead to the ultimate disintegration of the community. And then there is a perceived threat, so that anybody who wishes to reinterpret Islam or renegotiate in some ways, that is also seen as some kind of a threat. Now, in times of real external threat, the internal threat and the perceived threat get conflated. And everybody clamps up. And the religious orthodoxy can very easily say that, look, all these guys who are trying to reinterpret Islam are actually weakening religious community against these outsiders. And that's happening in India. There is no reform that is taking place within Islam. I have Muslim personal law in mind precisely because of the real external threat by a resurgent ultra-Hindu nationalism, right? So that's another issue, which is leading to the crisis of secularism. Secularism being identified only with protection of minorities, and the minorities that are being protected are seen to be orthodox, conservative, not progressive, and there are reasons why they remain so, right? Precisely because of that trend. Number three, for electoral reasons, this resurgent these Hindu nationalists, ultra-Hindu nationalists, are prepared to go to any length and cross the moral minimum. So there is communal violence. There is state-sponsored communal violence. And there is violence against not only Muslims, but also against Christians, which is, of course, a sure recipe for a very deep crisis of the Indian secular state, right? So you have violence against Christians taking place in Odisha, and you have violence against Muslims taking place in Gujarat. And all this is there because the Hindu nationalists want to get to power. And this is a good strategy to get to power, because by doing this, you are raising the communal temperature and making sure that there is communal polarization, right? So Hindus will identify themselves as Hindus rather than as citizens, and Muslims will identify themselves only as Muslims rather than as citizens, and so on. And this, to my mind, is a very important third reason for the crisis of Indian secularism. Violence leading to communal polarization actually threatening the secular state and undermining Indian secularism. And I'll mention this fourth, and then I'll stop. And this is that unless there are important rights which are given to, effective rights which are given to minorities in the whole of the subcontinent, I don't think we will be able to solve the problem of minorities in India. So as long as in Pakistan or in Bangladesh there doesn't emerge something like a secular state, there will always be a crisis of secular state in India. So it's still, the real issue is that the partition of the country and the formation of two states, and that might have a lesson even for the two-state solution that we're thinking of in Israel. The creation of two states has not solved the problem in India. I'll stop.
So please, let's open up. Yes, Ivan.
There is in the United States a sort of a growing effort by some of the young Muslims, but also by some of the Sufi-oriented white converts to Islam, to talk about creating an American Islam, an American civilization, which is Islam, an American culture, because they talk about the various cultural zones. And part of it is because we have Muslims from all over the world. So they can identify there's a Turkish Islam, a Persian Islam, an Arab Islam, an African Islam, and South Asian Islam. I think there's seven cultural zones, or something that have been identified. Is there anything like that in any European country where you have more than just Turkish people? Where you have, multiplicity of immigrants? Is there any recognition that Islam can create a European culture?
Yeah, I mean, they're very famous. This is not a mass movement yet, because the immigration is still at the stage which indeed, I mean, like the Catholic immigration here at the very beginning, there were always ethnic parishes, Polish, Italian, and so on, and now you have an American Catholic Church. But that's a long, long time. And in Europe, it's still imams from Egypt or Morocco or Pakistan and so on. But there are various elites. I'm thinking of this very well-known figure who is forbidden to enter the United States, incidentally, Tariq Ramadan, who is precisely talking in terms of the idea of European Islam, right? And this is bound to take on more and more saliency and importance. But it's at the moment it's an elite phenomenon, and sociologically one can't expect anything more of that at the moment. But it's definitely I think it has a future.
Yeah.
Please.
Yeah. There's also, it depends on who puts on these labels. So I think there is a trend exactly like European Islam, and even I would say Muslims becoming Islamic is a way of distancing themselves from national origins, right? Because Islam is much, because then you're not Turkish, you're not representing yourself through your parents' sense of belonging, national identities, but because you become Muslim, and then becoming Muslim means it's more transversal imaginary among other Muslims. So being Muslim and overtly Islamic in that sense, I make the distance of Islamic versus Muslim. It's more this conscious way of building your identity and refusing total assimilation. It means already a national distancing yourself from national origins. And in that respect, Tariq Ramadan is a very interesting figure because he tries to keep both European Islam. But there is other also ways of naming it, like Sarkozy, the French president, said we want French Islam and not Islam in France. And that was a very big controversy because he said in a nice way, saying that we want to take Islam out of the les caves, the basement, from the basement to the daylight, right? Saying that we have to create mosques and this and that. But this was also felt as something, a kind of control of Islam, or making it as Sarkozy wants. And also this Conseil Français du Culte Musulman also meant to create this institution as French Islam. But this creates, it's in between. It can create resentment because who labels you as French Islam? It means a kind of forced integration, assimilation, or it comes from yourself. I just want to add to that for our discussion in relation to Turkey, the moderate Islam, the label, coining the term moderate Islam became very problematic because many secularists now in Turkey who fear Islam, the radical secularist, hardline secularist, let's say Republican secularist, also became anti-American because they think it is America, United States, who push forward this project of moderate Islam. And the party in government today, the Justice and Development Party, which was moderate, I mean, not even moderate Islam, because they are just Muslim Democrats, right? But the term moderate had a very perverse effect on the politics. And this was one of the arguments, really, that prepared the judiciary coup against the party and for the closure of the party, saying they are trying to enhance moderate Islam with the backing up of the United States. So who creates these labels is also a very important power game.
And if I may add, of course, the comparison with Catholicism in America is very interesting because obviously the first debate is about how to organize itself as ethnic Catholic churches linked to the national church of origin, to use the argument of the German Catholics, versus as an American Catholic church made up of all the ethnic groups coming here. So this is the first. But then even once you define yourself as an American Catholic church, you define yourself as a separate pillar, not integrated, that basically protects itself from the hostile Protestant majority and maintains its culture, and thus the life world of Catholic schools and Catholic separate associations, versus the notion that no, America opens us the opportunity to be truly a public denomination, and we can even transform American society and play a role. So the debates between the Americanizers opening up versus, and so, but then enters the debates of Rome and the Vatican and the American heresy. But these tensions between ethnic Islam, which is national origin, versus the nationalization of Islam in European countries, versus the notion of a global ummah, which is transnational and therefore cannot be defined purely either in purely national terms, French Islam, or European terms, because we are talking now of a global system of world religions, and we have then a global ummah. So those are very interesting debates that, to a certain extent, were the same debates that took place within American Catholicism and its relations to the countries, European countries of origin, and the relation to a global Catholicism. So yes. Yes, please, and then you.
I just wanted to ask Rajiv about the third point that you're mentioning in terms of the cause of the communal religious tensions, as specifically as the ultra-nationalistic party. But my perception was, in terms of overall, it is the electoral process that you talked about in terms of trying to get vote blocks, that every party is trying to leverage, in terms of one party versus other, whether it's Muslim League or the smaller parties, and in that probably the larger parties are playing themselves in terms of trying to get these blocks, create this communal tension in terms of, in a way, turning them into a block that they will be able to come to power, not necessarily one party alone can try to come to power. So I'm just wanting to make sure that number 3 that you talked about, it looked to me like the cause of these tensions primarily from the ultranational party and not an interplay of all of it.
You're right. There is some truth in this. There is a rival kind of communalism of various parties, but it seems to me pretty clear that one of these parties is not only trying to get to solidify its own vote bank, but wants to do it by stigmatizing the other, and is prepared to go to any lengths to do so, which is to say that it can actually be violent, cross the moral minimum threshold. So what's happening in Orissa, for example, is something which is entirely unavoidable, entirely avoidable. I mean, you could worry about conversions, legitimately so, but I think that worry about conversions of Dalits or tribals to Christianity, that worry need not express itself in the form of violence against those people who already converted to Christianity. And the outcome of the violence should not be that they are forcibly reconverted to Hinduism. And that's what my worry is, that there is a certain minimum threshold that is crossed by certain parties when they are playing the electoral game. I don't deny that all parties will play vote bank politics, right? They will all try to carve out their own constituencies. That's part of democratic politics. And particularly if there are ethnic differences or ethnic, even cleavages which are there, then in democracy, political parties will try and take advantage of that. But a good constitutional democracy is one which does not allow political parties to play this game beyond a point. In India, that game sometimes goes well beyond that threshold. And that's what I'm worried about. The Congress Party has also done it to some extent. So you're right, the big parties have all done it. But I think there is, I mean, as the case of Gujarat has shown, one party has done it just a bit too much. Please.
Professor Taylor, I really appreciate your observations on the situation in France, which pretty much resembles the situation in Germany, right? And I'm wondering, what do you think, for the future, what has to be done either on the level of state politics or on the Muslim side? Because when you talk about integration in European countries, mostly you talk about the Muslim community. So what what are your thoughts?
No, no. I mean, I don't think there's a trend towards more aggressive secularism, because it isn't always a necessary feature of another bad trend, which does exist, which is a trend towards shying away from and exclusion of minorities that are different, where very often the real problem is the ethnic difference. I mean, what's really causing the emotional difficulty is the ethnic cultural difference. Right? And I think that, so it doesn't need to focus on the religious dimension, though that helps only because of the mobilization of Islamophobia really in these circumstances, which is serious enough. But the long-term problem is this sense of ethnic difference and sense of threat from that. And these things are only overcome by more mixing, people getting to know each other better and so on. So hopeful trends are that lots of people are becoming, immigrants are becoming integrated enough, I mean, to speak good German, to be able to operate in the public sphere and discuss with and exchange with others, and be able to break up some of the stereotypes in their audience about Muslims through that medium. Right? The danger is that there come to be populations that can't do that because they're more or less confined into poverty traps or traps in which they don't ever really get good employment and can't, as it were, promote themselves in the society, or can't get sufficient education and so on. And that is what I fear in the banlieue française. That's what I fear in places like Kreuzberg. I mean, this kind of, poverty trap, distance trap gets set up, and the process of getting to know better, mixing, exchanging, that can get us beyond this, can't get engaged in those areas. That is what I fear. But we had in Quebec this terrible set of reactions of this kind. That's why I sort of understand it from the inside. And we had a commission, and we had public discussion, and we discovered that getting people on television and everything, getting people to talk to each other and exchange, really brought the society forward. But that's partly because the Muslim element in Quebec is, in general, very highly educated, speaks excellent French. I mean, they're from the Maghreb. So it was relatively easy to do. It's not as easy to do in suburban Paris. But that's the direction that there's a lot of hope in.
But if I may add, because I think I'm a little more pessimistic about the very strong secularist prejudices in Europe, which are really an impediment. Mm-hmm. On the one hand, I agree that, let's say, in a country like Germany, there have been much more contested debates in the last, let's say, 5 years, but probably there have been positive consequences of this open contestation. That is, I think, as you point out, the same way that in Quebec. But there are other countries, let's say Holland or Denmark, which are the two extremes, very different types of societies. A society like Holland, that you could say was the model of toleration, had always tolerated the other minorities, Sephardic Jews, libertines from the French Enlightenment, the Puritans from England. But they were not expected to become like us. They were accepted, and eventually they became Dutch. But now we are so liberal and so tolerant as a society that we cannot tolerate the intolerant. And this notion that appears, this type of very, very definition of a liberal secular society, Holland or Denmark, that cannot accept the other, cannot accept very much different forms of life. And I think there is an element there that is very, very, very strong. So it's a question of dealing with otherness. That is very difficult for these societies, and in Holland it's a society based on pillars and on difference, but now that all the pillars have disappeared, a single Muslim pillar emerges as simply unacceptable. So there is this dynamic, which is a very, very, yes.
Can I just add?
Yes.
No, I think many of these societies, Denmark is a very classic example, they've been, religiously homogeneous societies for very long, and they are particularly prone to finding it very difficult to accommodate the kind of deep religious diversity that they have begun to face now. I mean, as long as the minorities were inaudible or invisible, it was fine. But the moment they become a little visible and a little audible, it becomes very difficult.
Also,
And-
ethno-religiously.
Ethno-religiously.
Homogeneous, both.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think it's very evident. I mean, I was appalled, although I may be mistaken about this, and maybe, when we, last year when we were in Copenhagen, I was told very casually by somebody that in Copenhagen, Muslims cannot bury their dead because they do not have any cemeteries. They've either got to send their dead home, and I was told that they really want to do that, or they have to send it on an island which is not far from Copenhagen that actually belongs to Sweden. So now, I'm not sure whether this is entirely true, but it was something that was told to me by a Danish friend of mine, and I mean, I can give you several examples. I mean, take for example the whole idea of schools. I think in the first school that was funded by the state in Britain was somewhere in 1997, sometime in 1997. And today there may be about 10 such schools which are funded. Compare it to the Roman Catholic schools, 2,000, and to Anglican church, 4,000. So I mean, and so there's a huge reluctance. Or take for example Berlin. Things are changing, and I hope they change rapidly, for the sake of not just peace, but for according respect to other faiths. But it took a long time for a mosque to be built there, as a mosque, so that most Muslims at one time had to worship in garages. And when the first mosque was being built, or an attempt was being made to build a mosque there, a lot of people had this very facile objection that it will disturb the Berlin landscape. So, nobody says it openly, but a number of bureaucratic hurdles are being placed in order to ensure that the desired outcome from our point of view, equal respect for all faiths, the desired outcome doesn't really come. One more thing I want to say in response to you, and then I'll stop it, and that is that, imagine the situation in Maharashtra today, right? I mean, it's completely crazy what had happened. But the government finally acted and arrested Raj Thackeray. And what was he doing? He was playing the ethnic card, right? There was such vitriolic rhetoric against people coming from UP and from Bihar in Mumbai. So it was not a religious issue. It was an internal ethnic issue. Vitriolic rhetoric. People were being beaten up. Their shops were burned. Their houses were burned, so that Mumbai remains for Mumbaikar, right? Now, and why was it done? It was done so that Raj Thackeray's party, which is split from Shiv Sena, becomes an important electoral player. I mean, that was the reason. But this is precisely the point, that you are crossing a certain minimum threshold.
Which is not religious, because this is...
No, this is not religious, but this is not religious. This is not religious. This is ethnic, right? Mumbai, Biharis. But what I'm saying is that in other places, just as we condemn that, in other places, it becomes a religious issue. And parties that cross that moral minimum should be condemned, and people who do this should be arrested in the same way that Raj Thackeray was arrested recently by the Maharashtra government, right?
Please.
Mass common scholars have argued that television and radio broadcasting played a huge role, particularly in the United States, with the rise of the religious right. As a journalist, I know that ethnic media is one of the only kind of growth markets still left in the United States. What role might media or information technology play, particularly in the rise of pluralism and secularism in the United States and these other countries?
this is obviously a very, very important issue because on the one hand it was a surprise for the traditional mainstream media to find out there were so many evangelicals and so many so-called fundamentalists in the United States. And equally surprised was the notion that those fundamentalists are really these hillbillies that of course are so unmothered and therefore cannot be sophisticated with media. So the way to which mainstream media was unaware of the existence of this reality, and also the way in which evangelical media showed its sophistication and became an important player in precisely competition, and then the extent in which then evangelical media becomes linked to main media through party mobilization and so on. So of course this is very important that we separate a category of fundamentalism that implies that those people are anti-secular, therefore anti-modern, and therefore not media sophisticated. They have been, of course, those who have advanced in many respects the use of media for mobilization, and that they are very much technologically oriented. Second, the origin of the element of social mobilization and of mobility, of social mobility that is linked to many of these religious movements. So they are not necessarily simply reactionary movements of protecting a life world of the past, but they are really, really movements of modern types of socio-political mobilization. Perhaps you wanted to add something.
I had a question about the terminology we use across these cases and in general. Nilofer, you told the interesting story of the term multiculturalism, its rise and its fall. Analytically, one could argue it still captures something, but normatively it's lost its bite. What are some candidates now, some terms that we can think of that apply to the individual cases, but also maybe comparatively, that describe this reality we're trying to get at of religious pluralism intersecting with secularism in a way that is true to the reality, but also could be adopted in political speech, could have some political viability? Can you think of other candidates to replace that gap that we need to replace?
Yeah. Well, I mean, in Quebec, we have adopted the term anti-culturalism, interculturalism. And it was partly because of a great reaction against multiculturalism, partly on extremely mistaken grounds, but never mind, it's a political fact. But it, as far as it has a core of rationality to it, it was meant to stress the idea that what we're trying to create is a society in which these different cultures meet, exchange, penetrate. So the idea of making the prefix inter instead of multi, because it was, and this is very much in line with the European reaction against the term, that it's very often targeted as saying, the policy here is just everybody go into your ghettos and have a good time and nobody's going to bother you, right? That was the idea behind it. In terms of the original Canadian policy, that is absolutely absurd. I don't know about it, but in terms of the way that they tended to treat the fact of multicultural reality in certain places like Holland and to some extent the UK, that wasn't entirely wrong. I mean, they didn't quite know how to deal with it, so they said, okay, not going to lean on you and so on. We'll offer these possibilities and those possibilities. And then the reason for the backlash is that they find profound alienation against the society, Holland, in some of these media. And then they're taken aback and they say, we've got to do something about it. And so they turn against their multicultural past, they think multicultural, without knowing exactly what to do about it. But, in Germany, I spent a year in Germany, and, Multikulti ist gescheitert. I mean, multiculturalism is total wreck, and you people in Canada, it's all your fault that you gave us this terrible idea, and so on. You have to say. I mean, for instance, are you trying to teach these kids German? What's that got to do with it? I mean, in Canada, it was It's absolutely axiomatic. Learning English and French is part of that. But because otherwise they don't integrate. But so there is a terrible crisis because this model is totally you can't use that word now. I mean, and that's why interculturalism might be. We have to invent a new word.
Right.
I think you really put your fingers to an important problem because we don't know how to frame these issues any longer. Intercultural is maybe the most appropriate to make the analysis and also will for a better Europe. For instance, I think for me Europe is interesting because we have to rethink of European Union on these terms. So because already it promises something to go beyond the nation state and one culture. So, but in a sense, intercultural ways of thinking Europe has not made its way yet, although I think it is unescapable. But for the moment, to go back to your question, if we are optimistic or pessimistic, I would say I'm also a bit pessimistic because it's rather trying to draw boundaries with Muslims that European identity is defined. That is, they need the other. They construct Muslims as the other of Europe. But I'm optimistic in another sense because it is the other Europe which creates the new Europe, right? So again, yeah, I'm really optimistic on that because when you see whatever became European today, it was in its encounter with Islam. Even cartoon controversy, right? It became the most European public space. It was through cartoon controversy. Headscarf debate, it became European as well. So Europeans, I'm totally in opposition with Habermas here. Habermas would say European public sphere doesn't exist because Europeans are not interested enough on the issues of Europe. No, they become totally passionate when it is about Islam. And they become a European public sphere. So in that sense, Europe is created in its encounter with the other Europe. So this intercultural mingling is not celebrated. And there is a place of conflict. Maybe we have to think about conflict as creating a new link in that sense. One other notion which is proposed by Ulrich Beck, German philosopher, is cosmopolitanism. I'm not sufficiently convinced with it, but it is a good move as well, trying to go beyond nationalism and as a methodology. And he would have said, for instance, for the Archbishop Canterbury's remarks, as a cosmopolitan conversion. It's interesting, borrowing. That is how different cultures can meet. The idea is how to make different cultures meet. And I think the meeting points today are conflictual and confrontational. It's our work, maybe, researchers, to understand that through these conflicts also become a new social reality, something new that is more hybrid, more intercultural, and maybe we shouldn't all the time celebrate only social realities that avoid conflict. Maybe multiculturalism was some kind of this tolerant but keeping the distance kind of attitude. Intercultural is much more humble. You have to accept, that's why I come back to this idea that you have to really give up your hegemony over the definition of values. If we want something intercultural, it is no longer integration of the migrants. It's more than that. Migrants are no longer migrants, they are citizens, and debating the values, common values. So how to name it, I don't know.
I think the issue is too, you mentioned hybrid. The issue is that the great challenge we all face is the question of multiple identity. So in reality, although it's not PC, the word that is really valuable here is hybridity. Because if we can begin, people coming from various perspectives can begin to think of themselves as hybrid, without hybrid being derogatory, that would be a great victory.
Métis is better.
Métissage.
Métissage is better.
Yeah.
Because hybrid is more static, whereas métissage is...
Okay, Luis and then Yvonne.
Well, in Latin America, of course, mestizaje
Yeah.
has been the standard tool for, sadly, often disguising discrimination and pretending like there is none.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
For example, I'm from Peru, a country that's very much divided by ethnic, social, economic, not religious, really, but a number of cleavages, which are often covered over by claiming, well, Peru is a mestizo, es una nación, el mestizaje defines what Peru is. And we avoid dealing with the many forms of inter and intra
Yeah.
ethnic and cultural domination.
Yeah, but it's
by
a,
saying
it's a
exactly-
lie, probably, yeah.
Exactly. Hey,
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it
Ivan?
makes sense.
Professor Taylor, I was just wondering, are the people you're in dialogue with in Quebec, are they Francophone to start with? Because it's different in Toronto, isn't it?
Yes, it is. I mean, this is totally Francophone, I mean,
Right.
very much a,
So they're mostly secularized
Yeah.
to being French.
they're mostly ex-Catholics, I mean, or partly secularized Catholics are on there. And they are still reacting very much against what they see themselves as having rebelled against, that oppression. So we had the same thing that you had in Turkey, right, and, analogous. Here is religion invading us again and taking us over and so on. Yeah, these were the very powerful reactions. Now what's interesting is that, I mean, there were two responses that were proposed. One is to come down on this with a very heavy, politically correct, you should be ashamed to say that kind of thing. Right? And the other was to let everybody talk it out. And we took the second policy, with some trepidation, because some terrible things were said in public, right? But I think it really worked, because they were responded to by other people, including very good Muslim spokespeople who came to the meetings. And even after a while, the media, who had been, part of whom had been our enemy because they were playing up this stuff to sell their papers and you know, cote d'écoute to their television stations, they began to come around and give real information. It was overcoming the stereotypes and so on. But that was within Quebec. It didn't have any, I mean, virtually any effect in Toronto. There really are two solitudes, right? It's the thing was carried out entirely in French, not translated, so it didn't have that much impact out
So,
there.
you know, are the Muslims who are secular in Canada, or even Quebec, because I know the difference between Quebec and Ontario, but do they identify as Muslim? Do they speak for the organized Muslims in this group?
To who, I mean, people who came were, some of them were from organized Muslim groups, others were just Muslims that are, and they were all kinds. I mean, there were some that were not practicing at all.
Right.
There were some that were very, very devout in practicing. So there was a whole gamut. But the majority of people who came forward and spoke were not representatives of any particular organization. I mean, they were just Muslims that were very concerned by this, and they said, you know, a whole lot of different things. But you found that, and this was all televised, so you found that something really started to pass, some messages started to pass in a quite extraordinary way in the whole society. Because, you know, it was fear-inspired. This kind of xenophobic sounding stuff is very often inspired by fear based on totally false stereotypes. And if you can get through to that, you can actually change it. It hasn't disappeared totally, but you can really make inroads into it. And some things that were said a year ago, you couldn't say them now because they would sound ridiculous, you know, in the...
Please, and then, please, and then.
Just curious, in the context of Europeanization and growing European normative identities, if there's any evidence that secularism has taken on a European tone, because it's very distinct, obviously, in the national context that you all
Yeah.
talked about. And is there any evidence that that there's anything called European secularism, or is it still sort of fragmented secularism between the former Catholic countries and the national churches?
I mean, it's invoked. And there are these big differences in national situations, but it's sometimes invoked by European politicians arguing about not admitting Turkey or something like that. But it's invoked in a very, very phony, I think.
It's never more than just sort
No,
of...
I think it's, for the moment, just, you know.
No, but this issue came, of course, was made explicit by the whole debate about the European Constitution, and whether there should be any reference to God or the Christian heritage. And then you have, on the one hand, a notion that any reference to Christian heritage means therefore not secular. On the other hand, so the conflict between a radical secularist position that has to precisely eliminate any reference from even Christianity as a heritage from any European identity, versus the notion that, there are very different types of secularism, even within Europe, that we have different models, and certainly the French, the problem is we cannot accept neither the French model of secularism cannot be made the European model. The Germans have a very different one. So the internal differences within Europe made it impossible to have one single model at the institutional constitutional level.
Yeah.
But there is a discourse. There's a discourse that you hear in the European public sphere, precisely in relation to Islam and the rest of the world.
Yeah.
And the discourse is roughly, basically, that we also went through these terrible processes of religious conflicts, religious wars, but then it's happened, happily from these catastrophic experiences, we learned to separate religion and politics, church and state, and now we can teach the rest of the world. And so when we see religious fundamentalism rising up everywhere, so there is a sense in which the European secularism has an internal story of how we free ourselves from these problems by separating religion and politics, and this is the model for the rest of the world, which of course is a historical fact, is a very difficult, is a very problematic myth, because the entanglement of religion and politics and church and state throughout Europe, I mean, you have the Lutheran church established in every Nordic country, you have the Anglican church established in England, the Orthodox church established in Greece, and so on and so on. So you have, not to speak of course of even in Lake France, the funding of, so all kinds of interpenetrations of institutional, ecclesiastical and political institutions. So it is the need to recognize the complexity, on the one hand path dependent and diversity, but on the other hand the fact that we are entering a world in which all these things are destabilized by global processes of immigration, of communication, of formation also of hybridity is of course a very nice thing, but on the other hand we see as a global process the formation of very clear purification of identities. So that where you had hybridity, let's say, Muslims and Hindus, they were hybrid, let's say, in South Africa or in Trinidad, because they had come together, sent by the British Raj, and they were a community. And now you have a purification of this hybrid community that becomes separated from one another, so you have, let's say, South African Muslims being oriented to a global Ummah, and Hindu South Africans also to a Hindu global community. So you have this globalization brings hybridity, but also brings very strong kind of global denominational identity. So those are very problematic, complex processes.
But yeah, just one, okay.
In my lifetime, I have seen a lot of hyphenated Americanism.
Right.
That term used.
Yes.
It seems to be going out of vogue at this present time. But when I think back on it, particularly in the large cities whereby the majority of the adult parents of the children were from other countries all over the world. But what was very important was when the child was in the school, he was told from kindergarten that no matter where your people came from, you are an American. And that was drilled in through all the elementary grades all the way up to high school and college. But I'd like to have Professor tell me the thoughts of Bernard-Henri Lévy when he wrote the book a century after de Tocqueville to see what changes were made in America. And he said something that was very interesting. He said, if you are Korean in San Francisco, you think you're American. If you're an Arab in Detroit, you think you're an American. And if you're Jewish in the Bronx, you think you're American. You could be all those three things in France, you wouldn't think you're American. I mean, you wouldn't think you're French.
I hope you wouldn't. I hope not. I mean, who is being asked to come? I am. Okay. Well, I mean,
a journalist, French journalist,
Yeah.
Bernard Henri Levy.
Philosopher.
He's a
He's
philosopher.
not unknown.
He would be offended by the
Yes, yes.
classification of journalism.
Who is it? You should
Yes,
ask.
yes.
I don't know, you should have asked. Who?
I should have, yeah, okay. Yeah, I mean, most of what he says is wrong, but in this case, I think, there's some truth, but there's only some truth. You see, because if you, the French had a tremendous success in assimilating lots of people from elsewhere before they, as it were, got outside the range that they could succeed in doing this. Those people that you mentioned, Korean and Jew, no. I mean, there are people I know French Jews that, La France is for them, right? But the others, yes. But there's a great range of people who are from Italian origin, from Polish origin, who feel more, I think, intensely and uniformly French than any American who might be tempted to have a hyphenated identity. It's really been an extraordinary country from that point of view up to a certain point. And the tragedy is that it's hit that point.
We'll give Niloufer and Rajiv the
Then come
opportunity to
back.
have some concluding
Well, I was,
thoughts or words.
I was just to react to Tom's question, but not about multiculturalism, but about secularism. I think India is, in some ways, unique that it's just holding on to that term. I mean, it's not just me who does it, but every politician, including those who actually are against a secular state, right? Everybody hangs on to the term, so that even people who are against secularism would say, well, we are really secular, and the other guys are pseudo-secular. And this is a term which is just sort of widely used by, it's a very important term in political discourse in India. But I find that that cannot be the only reason why we should be accepting it, number one. And number two, I find that that in the intellectual discourse in which we participate, the term is getting very, very problematic, and I don't know what a possible not substitute or rival for the term would be. Religious pluralism is an important term, but it doesn't quite capture what all secularism once used to capture, although it's extremely important. And I mean, so this is an issue that we're all struggling with, and I don't think we've really come up with an answer yet.
Niloufer, you have the last word.
No, just thanks.
Well, then thank you to all of you, and thank you all of you. And